and all that. So to me personally, it's just like, nice try, but at the same time, it's not really a nice try because it falls flat on its face when you actually take a look at the wording of the prophecy. Again, I'm going by what Joseph Smith clearly said that God decreed that it shall be built. It shall be built. Like,
So anyway, the reason I have you coming on because at least you have a background in philosophy and being educated more than I am, and also legalistic analysis is kind of important. Um, we were talking about Joseph Smith's prophetic calling yesterday with a group, and of course they brought up that the temple that was not built in Independence, Missouri, and the word "shall" is used in the instruction by the Lord, and a temple shall be built in the land of Jerusalem. And remember, I have to do some things with legalistic mindset. The National Electrical Code Book, which is um, almost a government uh, uh, associated document, and they
Yeah.
put the word "shall" in a permissive category, not a mandatory category.
Hmm.
So there was this back and forth. One of the people brought up the fact that it is an event that will take place. But whenever I read the definition again throughout the discussion, it says an event that is likely to happen. And my stance is the reason the word shall is put in there is not to give it the directive that this will happen. It shall happen based on contingencies.
Okay.
Now I looked up a couple of legal minds on the internet, Google, and it talked about how the word shall is almost a, um, a a swear word in the court because it has an unproven ground foundation behind it. When because it
Hmm.
because it can be interpreted too broadly, like the word accident. Accident's way too broad, but I'm just saying the word shall has some instead of saying the word may is categorized with along with shall
Okay.
in its definition. You may or you shall is seems I know shall has a more again determined outcome than may because it's may is what would you say a questioned demand, whereas shall is a more poignant demand, but it still has, but it's not you will. The word will would be a mandatory demand.
Okay.
So I'm looking for your input on the variances I just put forth, and do I have any basis to make my claim on?
Hmm. Let's see. Well, shall is a problematic term, uh, just because language shifts around on us, right?
Right.
Um, and but generally speaking, shall is interpreted to be a language of obligation. So I would disagree somewhat with whoever in your group said that shall means it is something that must come to pass or that will happen. But it's not what it's for. It's, at least in the legal world, it's typically used to indicate an obligation, something you must do, right?
Right. Even the word
Uh,
must seems to carry more weight than the word shall.
well, I mean, I've read some contract drafting treatises and done that in my prior life as an attorney, and you know, people get upset with the word must, but it is a clearer version, right? If what you mean is must, then you probably ought to say must, right?
Right. Right.
But generally, shall means it carries with it that, right?
Right.
Some people argue that you can use will, right? Will build a temple, um, as well. Um, uh, I don't feel strongly about it, but I sort of hold with those that believe that that might be a little bit weaker, right, than must. But again, note here that we're talking about levels of obligation, right? And an obligation is not a guarantee.
Right.
That's where people get things wrong. There's a whole field developed in information technology. Anyway, the field is called promise theory, and what he recognizes is that much of this language, we get ourselves all tied up in knots because we don't realize that it's one agent person promising another that they will do something in the future, right? Um, and this whole role of what it means to promise something or to be commanded to do something, neither of those are a guarantee that that thing will in fact happen, right? They're a statement of intent, an acceptance of responsibility, but neither guarantees that the state of facts represented in that statement will in fact occur at some future time.
And I think one of the things that you just pointed, there's two things I want to reflect on. The Kirtland Temple was a commandment that they built it in order to receive the 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 keys, which were going to be
Yeah,
presented.
yeah,
And then the other thing is, I think you get into programming. Is that right?
yeah,
Okay. In programming, you have and or not.
right.
The
The logic gates. Yeah,
logic within logic, you can substitute sometimes the word shall based on other circumstances within the program. It's not a common name, a common word within program,
yeah,
but it's like and or it also represents that shall.
yeah,
This event shall happen based on these events taking place beforehand and and post.
yeah. I mean, and you can do that in a legal document as well. You can say you know, if it rains tomorrow and is below 70 degrees, then I'll give you $1,000, right? If you show up tomorrow and say, "Where's my $1,000?" right? And it's not raining and is not below 70 degrees, right? Then I can say, well, the two conditions have not been fulfilled. Therefore, the obligation, the shall, is never triggered, right? As an example. Um, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, you're correct. There could be implied conditions on the obligation, right? Um, there, there's also, I don't know, there seems to be a confusion here because if I were to say, um, for example, I haven't read the exact language in a while, so bear with me if I'm a little bit off, but Christ prophesies the destruction of the temple, right?
Right.
That happens, but it doesn't happen for another 20 to 30 years.
Actually, that's 40 years after,
Right?
or
67 to
close
70
35,
AD,
30,
right?
yeah,
Yeah,
70 AD. So it's
right.
at least 35 years after his initial statement.
So for us, right, it's pretty easy to look back and say, well, that prophecy was fulfilled, as
Right.
I believe it was. But what about those who had heard the prophecy during those intervening 40 years? It hasn't happened yet, right?
In this generation, he says that the tip, which is according to, like I said, back to that discussion we had yesterday, a generation is 24, 25 years.
Right.
And so it doesn't happen within their generation.
Right. So again, what are we to make of that? I think when we have prophecy, another way to look at it would be this. The Ten Commandments are spoken with, I mean, although it's archaic English, they're essentially shalls.
Yeah.
Okay? Thou shalt, or thou shalt not. Okay? Now, those are clearly given as commands from God, right?
Right.
But people break them all the time. So why does that not cause us the same fundamental philosophical problem? If God can speak and say, thou shalt not kill, and then people still kill each other, well, what are we to make of the usage there, right?
Right.
And again, I think we all recognize that that usage is a language of obligation, right?
I have a
It's
question about that. Hold on just a second, because I want to make sure I get
okay.
the message, and if I put this up, post this, and they get the message. Are you saying the word shout and shall are the polar opposite, but they have um the same uh language?
Well, what I'm trying to
Polar
say
opposite.
is if you were to translate, I think, shalt into modern English, it would be shall, right?
Thou
So
shalt
thou,
thou
yeah,
shalt do no murder.
right.
Okay, I got you. Thou shalt do no murder. So
Yeah,
yeah, I just see it. Thou shalt not kill.
yeah.
Thou shalt. Okay, so they changed the language, and the word shall could have been used in thou shalt do no murder instead of thou
Yeah,
shalt not kill.
yeah. And so what I'm trying to say is when God gives a command to build a temple, it's natural for us to read that as a prophecy, right?
Right,
And maybe it is. I don't know yet. I suspect there still will be a temple built there. It wasn't built then, right?
right,
But we don't seem to struggle with it when we're in the position of the Ten Commandments. God says, you know, thou shalt do no murder, right? You shall not kill, right?
right.
And people still kill. Does that somehow invalidate God speaking? No, right? Um, you know, so I guess what I'm struggling with is shall is a word that has many possible applications. But at its heart, in my mind, is the sense of an obligation. God speaks using this word, and I choose whether I'm going to hear that obligation or not, right?
Right,
So, and respond to it. And the saints didn't hear and heed that obligation at that time, at least not enough of them to get the work moved forward, right? There were some who did. Um, I believe there was even a dedication of the cornerstone
yes, there was a
in
dedication.
secret before they fled, right?
Right,
So, I mean, again, I guess the whole discussion conflates the idea with if God says shall, then it must be like the pronouncement of a natural law, say the law of gravity, which one cannot violate, right? Versus an obligation, which one can fail to keep. That's the heart of it, is that it's a promise, right?
Right.
The same guy who's developed promise theory has looked at natural laws as promises that are just very routinely kept. They're not really made by an agent. They're promises that are made, if you will, by a state of affairs that hold true. Okay? But again, the law of gravity doesn't behave the same way here, right? I mean, it does, but we experience it differently here than one would on Mars, right?
Right.
That's not a violation of the law. It's actually entailed in the preconditions and how the law is worked out. So again, if one wants to argue something like, well, Joseph Smith's not a prophet because this didn't happen, right? No. I mean, I think that's a naive reading of the word shall, right?
Right.
Um,
Oh, they didn't like the fact that I brought up how the word was defined, to say the least.
yeah. So, again, from my legal background, I'm going to default to reading that as a must. And if there's a must, there's a sense of obligation. And if there's a sense of obligation, there's agency involved,
Right.
right? Because otherwise, right? I mean, think about the Book of Mormon, where we are compared to being less than the dust of the earth because the dust of the earth does obey the commands, right?
Right.
But it doesn't appear to have agency in the same way that we do, right? So
Right.
God
Right.
can speak and it will follow. It must, it does follow, right?
Right. Right.
It doesn't have a choice, but
Its
we,
obligation level is increased by the fact that it cannot articulate as
it can't choose to do otherwise,
right. It can't. Yeah, it
right?
doesn't have that ability. It can move on its own, but only in certain circumstances will it move on its own, meaning a gravitational force would have to draw it in. You see magnets and it
Right,
draws, but there's obviously a force that is moving it to 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 allow it to move,
right. And so the
which
sense of
doesn't
agent,
tie it into what you're saying, but it's kind of like I see
no,
your
no,
point.
it does tie in, right? So if God says this mountain must move, the mountain can't choose to disobey,
Right,
right? But we can. And so if God says there shall be a temple built here, right?
right,
Well, if the saints don't obey, right? Or if, I mean, here's another way I've heard other scholars speak about it, which is, yes, that was the command given, and the Lord sort of held that command in abeyance after, the persecution just ramped clear up, right?
right.
And maybe had the saints started at the time they were told to start, things would have worked out differently.
Yeah.
They didn't. And so we're wrestling with God's power versus the contingencies of history. And I don't have great answers there, but I know that it's not a naive, simple, you know, um, it's going to happen. And if it
Yeah,
didn't
I think
happen,
there's a difference there. What
yeah,
like you just said, and this will come to pass. You understand what I'm saying? So
yeah,
meaning that when it says when you go to Matthew 24, it talks about the calamities and all these things that will happen in the last days. These things will happen. There's nothing that man can do to alter this event. Wherein when it comes to the building of the temple, it is the effort of man to create that temple and not therefore he leaves it up to man to either fulfill that commandment or that prophecy
Yeah.
versus when he talks about the calamities of the earth, he's got total control over those things if he wants, whereas man has his free his agency to choose.
Yeah, I'm told that within the Jewish tradition, not my tradition, so I don't know for sure, but I've read a few authors of that faith who've indicated that there is a belief within parts of the Jewish tradition that God calls us to finish the creation with him by how we treat one another and how we build society and family and how we interact and even with the world, right? Um, that he created this earth and gave us stewardship so that we could take it and make it even greater under his guidance, right?
Right.
And yet we often choose not to do that. And
Right.
so I guess that's the sense in which I come at a conversation like that about the temple and that prophecy, as opposed to uh, the sense that, I mean, it's helpful to know that God can predict the future. There's often been times when that's been a key function in my faith, and I'm grateful that that is true. But I sometimes think that when God speaks to us, we we think of it as a prediction of the future when he may be saying, "Come do this work with me," and then we decide whether we're going to do the work with them or not, right?
Right.
And um, I think, for example, of the United Order, right? The law of consecration's never been rescinded, but how we live it has been changed. Certain ways of living it have been abated for now, right?
Right.
I don't I don't think that's a great thing, but it seems like it might have been a necessary thing. Um, how do we live that more towards that nowadays, right? I mean, right after the in the Acts of the Apostles, which we're studying, right, this coming week, the people start selling all their stuff and having everything in common.
Right.
Well, that's not really part of any church anymore, like specifically. Our church practiced it for a while, but it was very difficult. It takes a
Yeah.
covenant mentality that a lot of us haven't really gotten to, right? Uh, uh, and so, you know, that sense of shall and obligation to me has a lot of meaning, in addition to the prediction of the future state of affairs. But like you said, if we're talking about a natural state of affairs where there isn't much agency, there's just God's agency to command it, that's great. Here, he seems to have invited us to do a work. And for whatever reason, our ancestors in the church didn't get it done in the timing that he laid forth. Okay. And we
Yeah.
need to learn from that and do better ourselves.
I want to hit with this last part here.
Sure.
Remember the Thomas S. Monson talking about a revelation he received prior to the Berlin Wall coming down, where he said there will be a temple built in East Berlin.
Hmm.
And he had to go back. This was in front of an audience that he was talking to. And he had to go back and back to his room and back to his solace and
Yeah.
pray about it. And it was given to him to know that this is an event that's going to happen. There's a difference there where God said this will happen, whereas in the instruction of Joseph Smith, this shall happen.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to look at the exact language, but my recollection is that the language is there shall be a temple built.
Right. That's
Which-
what's in Doctrine and Covenants. And then in
Right.
24, it says, because of your faith and your due diligence, basically, I have seen that you've met your obligation, but because of the restrictions based on of man and their wickedness, I cannot move. We are not moving forward any longer on this.
Right. And
And
so,
yeah, so
I mean,
yeah, I'm sorry.
no, I think President Monson's prophecy, if you will, I mean, it's a good example, right? It's an example where that state of affairs was able to be brought about by the faith of many over decades, right?
Yeah,
To build that temple in, was it Dresden where they finally built it?
yeah, somewhere.
Um,
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but
in East Germany, and
which
based
I said
on
East Berlin,
faith.
but it was East
Yeah,
Germany. They said
right. Yeah, because I have a cousin who was amongst the first missionaries into East Germany after the wall fell.
right.
So, um, you know, there was, I mean, what a blessing for that to have occurred, right? Um, and yet, uh, had the church and the saints not been faithful, they could have obstructed, for a time anyway, the designs of God. But the designs of God don't fail.
Right.
Okay? Um,
And the
and
reason I
so,
know that, and the reason I know the Thomas S. Monson story so well is because he used the word miracle. And you know how I feel about words like miracle and accident. They don't fit into my language because when God says this will take place, it's a matter of fact. It ain't gonna, it's not something that I take lightly.
yeah, although experience has taught me that when that I should be cautious, because God can say this will take place and it will happen, but maybe not the way I conceive of it right now.
Right.
And certainly there's no guarantee that it'll happen in the time frame that I imagine. Right.
And the only reason that we know prophecy takes place is because first you have a spoken word about something that is supposed to happen in the future. And then when you take what happened in the future and you apply it to the past statement, you can tie the two together, such as Jesus Christ, his coming is very vague and written out in several different places in the Old Testament, not as clear as people want to make it out to be. Very vague. You have to
Mhm.
have the apostles in the New Testament say, well, this is how he, this is how, this is how he fulfilled this prophecy.
Explained it to us. Yeah, yeah.
They got to explain it out in order for us to understand that prophecy. And then in our minds, we're like, oh yeah, it did.
Well, yeah. And I mean, if that were bound in compulsion, first it would violate God's plan, but secondly, there were a bunch of Jews at Jesus's time who didn't see the connection between those two.
Right.
They heard what these guys had to say and said, "Yeah, we don't think so. We don't think Isaiah was talking about him." Right? Still to this day, there are many faithful Jews who don't see Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of those messianic prophecies, right?
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is I would say that he is the fulfillment of those prophecies, but that what appears obvious to us as a fulfillment of prophecy, even that is up for dispute sometimes, right?
Right.
And so people miss how much interpretation is going on here, right?
Yeah.
In understanding prophecies. Isaiah's prophecies are often fulfilled multiple times, right? There are events that fit those prophecies in more than one way, which makes them non-scientific, but not necessarily false, right?
Right.
I mean, or and anyway.